Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer number 141, but just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. In the last issue, we saw John take on a serial killer that had killed a bunch of people in one room of his house. Now, John found this guy because Watford called him in, even though Watford is part of the robbery division of the police department. I guess this was a big enough thing, or there were robberies connected, so he was part of this case. And the reason he called John is because a couple of his guys went in already to confront the man and arrest him, and they never came out. So they died as well. So Watford called John because it seemed like this was something supernatural. And John did end up helping out, albeit reluctantly. And he was able to capture the man and bring him outside, and also burn down the horrible, cursed or possessed room that had all this bad juju from all the dead people that were buried under the floorboards. And that brings us to issue 141. And if you look up this issue, just the actual number, Hellblazer 141, you're going to get some weird information because there was actually two issues 141. The original one was called Shoot, and that was just a one-shot. I should say, like, after the first story arc, Haunted, the rest of these are all kind of one-shots until we get Brian Azzarello on issue 145. So Warren Ellis's run is pretty short, but in keeping with these odd one-shots, one of them was called Shoot. It was a story about a school shooter, and the release of that issue happened to coincide with the Columbine shooting. So because of that, they pulled the issue quickly, and we get this story, which is called The Crib, and it is written by Warren Ellis with art by Tim Bradstreet. And they did eventually release that issue called Shoot. They just released it under that name in 2010, I believe. And it is collected now within the trade paperbacks of the Warren Ellis Hellblazer run. But I thought that was kind of interesting because I knew that issue existed, and I've read it before. I just didn't know it was supposed to be part of this run. And then when I looked at the number of this issue on the internet, it kept saying that 141 was the issue called Shoot. So I don't know if they had to scramble for this issue or if they just had a couple on the back burner already and they just put this one out instead. But that's the whole backstory on this issue. I just thought it was interesting and you guys should know it. But first things first, with issue 141, we got the cover. We see John smoking, standing in front of a wall that has a bunch of stone carvings of demons tearing people apart. And like I said before, this is written by Warren Ellis and drawn by Tim Bradstreet. And I think that's kind of interesting because Tim has been doing the covers, which I love, but now he's actually on the interiors. And it does add like a different feel to the art. And we start off on the first page in what looks like a desert landscape. We see there's a thunder and lightning storm going on. And there was one single hut in this empty desert. And we see someone riding a camel up to the front of the hut. And then we cut to the inside and we see what looks like a woman giving birth. And over these panels, the narration says, Bethlehem 1 BC. A woman's scream marks the place where the dreams of a secret society dating back to the time of Moses are ground beneath the heel of chance. Here in autumn in Bethlehem, the world grinds to a new set of tracks, takes a new course, impelled by the society's chosen receptacle, miscarrying the Antichrist into a filthy feeding trough. Then we cut to the inside of the house, and we see three men who are wearing black robes, and they have some kind of tattoo designs on their faces and hands. And we see the woman is staring at them, and one of them reaches out and puts a hand to her lips like telling her to be quiet. And she is crying, but then she spreads her legs to give access to the hooded man who touched her lips a second ago. And he reaches down in between her legs to get the miscarried child. And over these panels, the narration says, Come winter, now, the Christ child will be born, and now there will be no opposite to match it. There is nothing to do but salvage that which can be recovered, and draw new schemata for a dark world. Then we turn the page and we see the priest's hands holding up the miscarried child. It is very, very deformed. Its skin looks like it's flaking off, and it doesn't have all its appendages yet. And there's a giant umbilical cord coming out of its stomach, but it looks more like a tentacle. Then we see one of the other hooded men open a wooden box that's very ornate, and it's just about the right size for this miscarried infant. And the box looks pretty standard, just your average ornate box, but I will say that the floor of it on the inside is this crazy mosaic that's full of bright colors. It almost looks like a piece of stained glass or something. And I mention that because it comes up later. But over these panels, we get the narration continuing, saying, "For the Antichrist's twisted neonate still lives, possessed by appalling power, driven by hate, refusing to leave life until he has pissed in it." We also get the title of this issue, which is The Crib. Then we turn to modern day, and we get a panel of a city street, and the narration says, "New York City, 1999. How things connect up." Then we get the next panel that has a steel bridge with a lot of girders and stuff, and we see something is hanging off of it from a piece of rope. And the narration continues, "A sculpture made out of an antique smuggler found dangling from a bridge in Northern California." Then we get a panel of a body on fire, but we can only see his head. And even though the flames are engulfing him completely, he's not yelling or screaming, he's just looking out straight towards us. And the narration continues, "A bent cop who has been on fire for 3 years, inexplicably defeating any attempt to douse him." Then we get a panel of a man who is half in and half out of a wall, and the narration continues, "A criminal gang found fused with the walls of a warehouse in Maine." Then we see the body of a man who is on the floor, and he's in some sort of robes, and he's surrounded by his own blood. And the narration continues, "A priest in New Jersey who was stuffed with razor blades and then stamped on." And then the last panel of this collage of events is of a circulatory system for a human. And the narration says, "A man who only killed twice, therefore avoiding serial killer classification, but whose imagination ranked with the best, for he did a fair job of slashing out and stealing the entire circulatory system of his victims." And then we cut to a man typing on a computer furiously. He is smoking. He is a white guy in his mid-40s. And it seems he is the narrator narrating these panels. And his narration says, "And me, David Niles. All of us connected by 2 things. The book, the Horseshit Book Commission, Murder and the Occult, and what I found researching it, and the crib." Then we turn the page and we get a picture of that crib, which I think is supposed to be the box that the Antichrist's miscarried fetus is in. And very creepily, the umbilical cord of the child seems to be coming out from underneath it and wiggling around. And David's narration continues as he writes, saying, "A thing of legend, a box containing the immortal miscarried fetus of the Antichrist. The stained glass window set in the crib's base is said to have a little hole in it. It is said that the awful thing inside can stretch out its blackened umbilical and pierce the skin of the living, urinating through it into the victim's bloodstream, and so gifting that person with dark talents. The man who ripped the veins and arteries from his 2 victims believed himself to be the assaulting possessors of the crib, and was attempting to keep the powerful corrupt blood from moving." Then we get a panel of 2 detectives who look very sloppy and unfit for the job. One of them is actually wiping food from his face, and we can see that whatever he was eating also stained his shirt as well. And the narration continues, "Accidentally caught by a journalist, the killer himself was tortured to death. In complete, eerie silence in a police cell, with no witnesses. By whom? Someone who wanted to know what the killer knew?" Then we get a panel of the stained glass from the bottom of the crib. And in those little shards of glass, we see each of the murders that David has just described. And then David leans back and kind of thinks to himself as he smokes. And his narration continues saying, "The priest claimed, in grubby circles that priests aren't supposed to know of, to have destroyed the crib. The bent cop was thought to have stolen it from a tramp he rolled. The smuggler, some months before his death, openly advertised his intention to track down, obtain, and sell the crib. All dead. Someone's looking for it. Someone terrible. And then we see David sit up in his chair and kind of look out at us and smile, and his narration says, "And here I stay, spending my nights pretending to write this book, while the last frayed edges of this thing tie together." And then he hears a knock at the door. So he gets up and he goes to answer it, and he looks at his watch and says to himself, "At this time of night?" And then he unlocks the deadbolt, and as he does, he says, "Not that I get visitors any fucking time. Take a few seconds to feel a bit stupid. Answer the door." And as he opens the door, we see there's no one standing in front of it, and then he shuts it, and he looks around in his house, and then all of a sudden the lights go out. And then it's not just the lights, it's also the lamp that was next to his computer, and his computer screen completely turn off. And then a bunch of crows begin to smash into his window. And then all of a sudden there's the sound of a lighter opening. And then we get a flame light in the room, and with that, the lights turn back on. And we see John Constantine is lighting a cigarette, leaning against the wall, and he says, "All right, Squire." And as he says this, he's got a big grin on his face. And David is confused as he sees Constantine, and he says, "Who the fuck are you?" And John takes a drag of his cigarette and says, "Not the question, sunshine. Question is, who are you? And what have you been playing at?" And David stares at John wide-eyed and says, "Nothing." But John kind of side-eyes him and says, "Don't lie to me, son." And then he walks over to a painting on the wall, and the painting looks like it has a lot of religious iconography on it. And as John stares at it, he asks, "How's the book going? Researching going smoothly, is it? Never really fancied that game myself. I bet you think you're a clever little bastard, don't you?" And David answers, No, I'm just a writer." And then John side-eyes him again and says, "Not what I'm talking about." And then John walks over to a lamp and turns it on, and he continues saying, "David Niles. That a name I should remember then? Get your autograph now, should I? For I have to pay to talk to you." And David, not taking his eyes off John, says, "I want to know how you got in here. What are you doing here?" And John takes another drag of his cigarette and says, "Magic. You know all about magic, don't you? And the crib." And David feigns ignorance, saying, "The what?" But John isn't buying it, and he says, "Don't bullshit me, Sonny Jim. Everyone in town's talking about it. You know. The crib, the killings associated with it. The killings go on and on. Tell me about the crib, Dave. Tell me what you found out." And then Dave kind of pauses and looks at John and says, "You want it, don't you?" And then John looks seriously back at David and says, "What makes you say that, Dave, old son?" And with that serious look, Dave all of a sudden realizes that John is the person that he was talking about in his writing/narration from earlier, where he said, "Someone's looking for it, someone terrible," but he didn't know who, and now he does. And he begins to freak out, saying, oh God, it's you." And as he says this, he kind of grips his chest. And then we turn the page and we see him ripping his shirt off. And underneath his shirt, we see the crib, and it seems to have merged itself with his chest. But it was flat enough that John didn't see it, so it looks like it's kind of absorbing into his body. And we see all these creepy veins coming out from the center of it, like there's an infection spreading and it's corrupting his body. And as the box is revealed, David holds out his arms in a Jesus Christ-like pose. And he looks at John with wide eyes and says, "Is this what you want? Is this what you want?" And John just looks disgusted and says, "Wasn't top of me Christmas list, if I'm brutally honest with you, Gov." And then with tears streaming down his face, David says, "There was a killer. I caught him completely by accident. He had the crib. It leapt from him to me. The devil's miscarried son pissed in my fucking veins." And John doesn't seem impressed by this, and he says, "What do you want, a bleeding medal?" And this angers David, so he gets in John's face and yells, "Do you know what it's like? Do you? Of course you fucking don't." And then he points to the box in his chest and says, "I visited him in prison and tortured him to death by fucking looking at him. That's what the crib does for me. That what you want? You thought you'd trap me and take it, huh? Huh? And then he walks away from John, and he stands in a doorway and rests his arms on the frame, and he says, listen, you're locked in here with us now. Do you know what I can do to you? And John doesn't say anything, he just stares back. So David continues, all the death and murder and filth and horror in the world, all the feeding of what it's like to be dead, as if your nerve endings were still working 5 seconds after your death. I can compress all that into something that seems like a lifetime and squirt it directly into your brain. Then John gets a big grin on his face and says, course you can, son. Course you can. And then he walks over to the refrigerator in the room and he opens it. And as he bends down to look inside, he says, not done you any good though, has it? Bet accidentally catching the bloke who used to shit in the exposed lungs of his victims. Did your head in a bit too. Did me research. Checked your killer out. Must have fucked with your mind to find the witness you were visiting to interview was actually the man. And then John gets a quizzical look on his face as he looks into the fridge, and we can't see what he's staring at, but he continues saying, don't think I'll be stopping by for dinner, by the way. Then we get a panel of inside the fridge, and we see next to a bunch of beer and condiments, there are a couple skulls and heads on plates, and a bunch of other body parts as well. And then John stands up and walks away from the fridge over to a cabinet, and he opens that, and we can't see exactly what's in there, but there's definitely a jar with something floating in it, and we can see the top of what's floating out of it, and it's a toe. So it seems David has a bunch of dead body parts in his apartment, and John is insinuating that David is actually a journalist who was investigating the serial killer, and as he went to interview a witness, he found out that that witness was in fact the serial killer. And then David said that that is where the box transferred to him, and we can assume that that's why there's other people being killed now, because David's been doing it, and he's been keeping the body parts in his fridge. So John turns to David after he makes these grisly discoveries, and he says, you're a naughty little fucker, aren't you? And a very angered David clenches his fists and says, I will make you die for months. I'll kill you and bring you back again just to kill you better. But as David's saying this, John reaches out and he grabs onto the box that's embedded in David's chest and he pulls it out. And we see all this like gross viscera and skin and muscle coming off with it. And as John does that, he says, shut it. And then John flips the box over, and from the bottom, he sticks his thumb in the hole where that umbilical cord of the Antichrist is supposed to come through, and blood comes pouring out of the hole and onto John's hand. And we see David look down at his chest, and now his chest looks completely normal. There's no scarring or visible wound where the box was. And as he stares at his unaffected chest, he says, oh, as if reality's coming back to him or something. And then he looks up at John, and instead of John holding a wooden box that's ornately carved, now he is holding a small box of Fluffy Flakes, which is a cereal, I guess. And there's a hole in that box and a bit of tape on the edges where it was holding securely to David's chest. And inside the hole is a dead rat. So I guess when John stuck his thumb through, he smashed into the either dead body of this rat or he killed the rat with his thumb. And as David sees the box, it's almost like his body realizes something and he falls down to the floor. I'm not sure if he's dead or if it's just like a catatonic state. But John tosses the cereal box with the dead rat onto David and he says, sad bastard. And then we do a zoom in on the cereal box and the rat inside, and John's narration says, no such thing as the crib. Never was. I heard that Alpheus Levi made it up on a Jim and Damiana bender during a selected tour of Mexican whorehouses. Who knows? Maybe it's even true. If it hadn't been Niles's fellow wannabes in the New York occult underground he'd been offing, this might have been over months ago. It was the killers and the victims' need for magic that kept it going this long. And then we cut to outside the building where John is leaning against a wall and smoking, and his narration continues. The thing about magic is, you can't tell if it's real, because you can't touch it, can't hold it. If someone's sure there's a thing called a crib that makes you really scary, who's to say there isn't such a thing? Not David Niles. He really thought he had the devil's aborted son on his chest, peeing into his heart, Not a tiny cornflakes box with a dead mouse inside, scotch taped over his fucking nipple. No crib. Just some sado journalist who lost his shit after discovering a serial killer in his lair, living in a world entirely of his own construction, until he started killing locals and sticking them in his fridge. Then we see some police cars arrive, and John's narration continues saying, "If I hadn't been passing through. All right, if I hadn't been admiring the tits on the little goth girl gushing about the magician killings and the man with the crib, then it could have gone on forever. 911. Took him 10 bloody minutes. Time to wipe me prints off and have a piss and a cigarette. Terrible, really. Someone once asked me if there was such a thing as magic. Only if you want there to be. Only if you want it." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.